Dr. Steve Haynes. Again, Dr. Haynes is professor of religion at Rhodes here, a neighboring college. He's incredibly well published. He talked a good bit last week about Bonhoeffer, and if you want to know more, and he didn't tell you this, he said he has some books that he could recommend. Two of them are his own. So if you want to know more about Bonhoeffer, get online and order either of his books about him. They're both outstanding. So check that out. He is here, and his topic this week shifts a bit to our own day and age. He's been looking at the subjects from ISIS to Ferguson and how we think about religion, race, and the use of force. Please welcome him warmly back to GSL.
Thank you. It's good to be back. Starting to be a regular thing. I'm going to have to wean myself next week. I've been thinking about Richard a lot this week because he came up with the title that he just announced to you. And I was reflecting on titling presentations. And of course, you want to be concise, you want to be provocative, but you also don't want to promise more than you can deliver. And I think in this third case, we kind of went awry. I feel like explaining ISIS, Ferguson, and everything in between is going to be a little more than I can deliver. But what I want to do is, by way of review, present what I think are three viable Christian approaches to understanding violence. And then, after I've done that in some detail, I want to ask you to try to apply what we've learned to these two case studies that are particularly, I think, in our minds right now. One is ISIS, the other is Ferguson, not so much the event, but the things that it revealed and the sort of ongoing struggle to address racism and systemic prejudice in our country. So that's my plan. All right? So I want to start with the first way of understanding violence, approach to violence. I want to call realism, and I want to describe that in some detail, but remind you that last week when I talked about Reinhold Niebuhr and Dietrich Bonhoeffer, Niebuhr was the one who had probably done the most among Christian theologians to describe this point of view and to make it a sort of a viable approach to violence in general. But it's much older, obviously, than Reinhold Niebuhr, than the 20th century. It goes back, I would say, to the New Testament, and the place where we might look to see a realistic understanding of violence and force portrayed as Romans chapter 13. If Romans 13 were the only part of the New Testament that spoke about violence and authority, then having this discussion would be very simple, because it's pretty clear about what it describes as the role of government, the role of police force, and by extension, the role of war. So will somebody read, these are the first 5 verses of chapter 13 of Romans. It's probably familiar, but if somebody who can see that far would read it aloud, that would get us started.
Everyone must submit himself to the governing authorities. There is no authority except that which God has established. The authorities that exist have been established by God. Consequently, he who rebels against the authorities is rebelling against what God has instituted. And those who do so will bring judgment on themselves. The rulers hold no terror for those who do right, but for those who do wrong. You want to be free from fear of one in authority, then do what is right, and he will commend you. He is God's servant, do you good. If you do wrong, be afraid, for he does not bear the sword for nothing. He is God's servant, an agent of wrath, to bring punishment on the wrongdoer. Therefore, it is necessary to submit to the authorities, not only because of possible punishment, but also because of conscience.
Thank you. So this is in Romans, Paul's letter to the Romans, where he's introducing his gospel to the church at Rome, and it's probably more full of doctrine, more systematic than his other letters. And this is a pretty clear description of what the Christian's attitude toward government ought to be. It's a good thing. It's instituted by God. The sword, what he describes as the sword, is carried for a reason, to to assure order, but also to punish people when they deserve it. So don't be afraid of the government unless you do something wrong, right? This is Paul's sort of approach. And it is a sort of comforting approach to the question of authority and violence. There's an assumption here that the person who carries the sword, metaphorically, is going to be motivated by the same things that motivate us, peace and order and so forth. It doesn't address the problem of tyranny or of abuse of power, so it doesn't address all situations, but it gives us kind of a baseline for understanding the role of force and power in the world. It's a good thing. We ought to be appreciative of it. God has had us in mind when he set up rulers with police authority. With me so far? Very realistic, somewhat comforting understanding of the world. So we next move to Augustine, and we've talked about off and on. I think the first time Augustine was mentioned was when just war theory was described. Augustine is the first exponent of just war theory, but he does a lot more than just talk about war. He has a book. I've never read the whole thing. If you have, congratulations. It's called The City of God. It's probably about 1,000 pages of small print. His ambition in that book is to describe all of human history from the beginning basically to the end, and explain how it is that we should think of the earthly city in relationship to the city of God or the heavenly realm. And his basic thesis is that as long as we're on this earth, we will be inhabiting the earthly city, no matter what our spiritual values are, no matter what our commitments are. We need to keep in mind, however, as Christians, that we are on our way to another kingdom, a kingdom where peace will reign, a kingdom that even today has different values, and we as members, as citizens of the earthly kingdom, can celebrate those values and try to spread them, but ultimately must remember that we live in the city of earth, a city that is perverted in its values, that understands power, basically, rather than love. So this idea of city of God versus city of man is at the basis of Augustine's realism, which is that, as you can tell by the fact that he is an advocate of just war theory, sometimes war is necessary. Regardless of how well-meaning people are, regardless of whether or not a government, a kingdom is Christian in its values, it still may be necessary to wage war. And we do so hopefully in love with the goal of ultimately bringing peace, but nevertheless, it's still war, and the rules of war prevail. The thing about Augustine that I think is most helpful to remember is that he is the one who's responsible, probably more than any other theologian, for our understanding in the Reformation tradition of sin and its work. He has a theory of original sin, which is important, but original sin for him has kind of a double meaning. It refers to the first sin in the garden, but it refers to the fact that as a result of that first sin, human nature was corrupted. And everybody after Adam and Eve, as much as we would like to do good, we are incapable of doing it. It's not really our fault. It is our fault in a way, but it's also something that's been fated because human nature itself fell. So we should not expect too much of human beings, whether they're redeemed or not, because after all, we share in this corruption of human nature. Everything we do is steeped in sin, corrupted by sin. So talk about pessimism. If pessimism is the hallmark of realism, we can see where the pessimism comes from in Augustine's case. That human nature itself, not just you and I, but our very nature, the stuff that we have to make our lives of is corrupted by sin. And then, of course, we know about just war, which I won't talk about too much, but again, just to emphasize, just war tradition is a sort of acknowledgement that for there to be peace, for there to be justice, for there to be protection of the innocent, war may be required. So the worst thing that we can imagine, war, may be necessary to ensure a life, a society that is livable. Okay. I want to talk about Martin Luther a little bit. Luther's a good example of realism. He's responsible for what's usually called the two kingdoms doctrine, which is not quite the same as the idea we have of separation of church and state, but similar. And Luther's notion, it came really from Romans 13, the idea that God was responsible for setting up whatever powers existed in a given culture. In his case, in Germany in the late medieval period, it was the Holy Roman Emperor and then a series of elector princes in these various regions in Germany. They were the authorities. And he saw that as a gift from God. Because Luther recognized that without some kind of power in place, the world was a pretty bleak place. There was a lot of suffering, a lot of greed, a lot of will to power, people abusing other people for their own interests. And without a state, without some kind of order, life would be scarcely worth living. So we ought to thank God, Luther says, for the fact that there is, in every case, some sort of authority. The job of that authority, and this, by the way, both these kingdoms have their origin in God. It's not a matter of secular in the sense of completely independent. It's a matter of this is a secular entity, but one set up by God. The secular kingdom has as its main duties to maintain law and order. That's the job of the secular kingdom. And however the secular kingdom decides to do that is really not the matter of the church to criticize. And there are various ways, different times in history, that law and order can be maintained. The job of the church is to preach the gospel. And actually, the job of the church is much easier if the secular kingdom does its job, because a chaotic situation, a chaotic world makes it very difficult to preach the gospel. So these are symbiotic entities, both set up by God, but they have different roles. And you can see the way realism is inscribed here, because if the church doesn't really have a lot to say about how the secular order maintains order, there's a kind of attitude of, well, whatever it takes, right? Luther has a famous example of the Christian executioner, the person whose job it happens to be to cut off people's heads, essentially, to execute people. He's also a Christian, and Luther asks, is there a contradiction here? No, there's not. Why? Because in both cases, whether he's in church and preaching the gospel and trying to extend the reach of the gospel, or whether he's killing, whether he's executing, he's still somehow, his vocation is being dictated by God, even though it's in different realms. There's no contradiction there. It's a great example of the way Luther saw authority and force and maintaining order as an important function of government, one that Christians ought to be appreciative of and should have no problem participating in. Okay? With me so far? I'm always suspicious in class of too much assent. Okay. So going back to last week, Reinhold Niebuhr is the sort of modern apostle of realism. And if you recall from last week, it's a position he came to over time after being a pacifist and a Marxist and somebody who was very much convinced of human beings' ability, if given the time and the right motivations, to really arrive at the kingdom of God on earth. He came to see that as a terribly naive approach. And so by the time he writes Moral Man and Immoral Society in 1932, he says this about violence, which is this coming from somebody who 10 years before had called himself a pacifist. If a season of violence can establish a just social system and can create the possibilities of its preservation, there is no purely ethical ground upon which violence and revolution can be ruled out. So I mentioned last time that Niebuhr was at the forefront of the interventionist movement in 1939, 1940, which was a group of Americans calling for intervention in Europe to try to forestall the invasion and the destruction of Britain. So modern political theory, which I don't know a great deal about, but which I know has its roots in Augustine and Niebuhr and other people, is a very viable understanding of international relations and the way the world works. And this is how it's described by an advocate of realism. Will somebody read this sort of definition of realism in modern political theory?
Realism is first an expression of doubt regarding the prospects of achieving perpetual peace in international relations. It is second, the advocacy of a politics of prudence informed by that foundational skepticism. It is third, the recognition that the statesman must be willing to commit morally unpalatable acts, kill, to deceive, to break promises, if such acts are required by the prudent defense of the national interest.
Thank you. And you can probably see reflections of just war thinking in the background here, right? That ultimately just war theory understands that to achieve the peace and the justice that we desire, we may have to, in the meantime, pursue war. And this, to me, sort of sums it up. That the statesman, the government, must be willing to commit morally unpalatable acts if they're required for prudent defense of national interest. Hopefully you're already thinking about ISIS and Ferguson. You can see where realism, I hope, might provide some guidance for how to act, for what one should expect and be willing to endorse in a situation like this. So keep that in mind. So the second point of view, the second overall approach to violence that I think needs to be taken seriously by Christians is pacifism. And I think I said this last time, I want to emphasize it again. My students often confuse these two words of pacifism and passivism, as if being a pacifist is being also passive. It can be. Most pacifists are not passive at all. They are very active in their engagement with trying to resist violence in various ways. A good example of a pacifist action that is not passive is conscientious objection, right? I read the other day, I didn't know this, that there was at least one conscientious objector in World War I. Anybody know what happened to him?
Executed.
Executed, yeah. So people my age and older are familiar maybe with the Vietnam era, where people were conscientious objectors, and maybe they went to jail, maybe they went to Canada, maybe they were celebrated as heroes, but certainly they didn't expect to be executed. This is not a passive position. This is one that has real consequences. So we begin with the Hebrew prophets, and I would suggest that in Isaiah, in Jeremiah, and some of the 8th century prophets who look forward to a time when all Israel's problems will be solved and peace will come, we have a message about pacifism, which is basically God is in charge. God is in control. God will redeem the world. We don't have to take matters into our own hands. This is a vision of what that will look like when it happens. Will somebody read from Isaiah 11, please?
The wolf will live with the lamb, the leopard will lie down with the goat, the calf and the lion and the yearling together, and a little child will lead them. The cow will feed with the bear, their young will lie down together, and the lion will eat straw like the ox. The infant will play near the hole of the cobra, and the young child put his hand into the viper's nest. They will neither harm nor destroy on all my holy mountain, for the earth will be full of the knowledge of the Lord as the waters cover the sea.
Thank you. So what kind of image is this? It's very powerful. What's this world like?
No violence.
There's no violence, not even the natural violence that we associate with animals, right? So this isn't about, greed and betrayal and so forth, but even the animals that are naturally predators of each other suddenly will just get along fine. And the bear and the cow will sort of hang out together, and the lion, the wolf and the lamb, and the child will sort of play around the cobra's hole. It's really a remarkable vision of what the future will be like on God's holy mountain, which will be a sort of, will be the starting place for a kingdom that covers the earth with peace. So then we've got the pacifism of Jesus. I mentioned last time that the thing that was crucial in changing Dietrich Bonhoeffer's understanding of the Christian's orientation toward peace was his encounter with a guy named Jean Lasserre in New York in 1930 who took the Sermon on the Mount seriously, who took it seriously in a different way, who saw it not as a sort of counsel of perfection that reminded us how far we fall from keeping God's ways, but was actually a way of life that was incumbent on Christians. And so when Bonhoeffer writes his book, The Cost of Discipleship, in 1937, he's taking very seriously this idea that what Jesus says in the New Testament, the words of Jesus, are not just nice stories to think about, to teach our children. They describe a way of life. So someone read these four excerpts from the Sermon on the Mount and other places. Actually, these are all from, three of them from the Sermon on the Mount, that talk about what pacifism looks like in Jesus' own view.
You have heard that it was said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But I tell you, do not resist an evil person. If someone strikes you on the right cheek, turn to him the other also. Love your enemies. Do good to those who hate you. Bless those who curse you. Pray for those who mistreat you. Put your sword back in its place, for all who draw the sword will die by the sword. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called sons of God.
By the way, you all are great readers. Just the drama and the clarity is so nice. So, is there any ambiguity in these statements? They're pretty straightforward, aren't they? Uncomfortably straightforward. Right? Now, how we interpret these statements, what they mean for us today, of course, is another question. But it seems to be very clear that the largest block of preaching material in the New Testament by Jesus is basically on a single theme, and it's a fairly clear theme that comes through very clearly. So, as far as pacifism goes, we have to say that it might seem impractical and it might seem difficult to achieve in the world we live in, but it has in its favor the fact that Jesus seemed to advocate it. And if as Christians we're curious about what a Christian understanding of violence might look like, that's a pretty strong thing to have in your corner, right? That Jesus seemed to articulate this as at least one approach to violence. So it's not surprising then that the early church followed up on Jesus' lead. And it turns out, it won't surprise you, that before the 4th century, before the conversion of Constantine to Christianity and the sort of movement of the Roman Empire from official position of opposition to Christianity to tolerance and then to embracing Christianity, during that period before that happens, the assumption among early Christians is that pacifism is the Christian way. It was assumed that it really didn't have to be defended because, after all, we're following Jesus. It's very clear what Jesus said. And so the question becomes, is it possible for a Christian to serve in the army? And you think about what that question means relative to our own country, our own situation. If you ever go to Grizzlies games like I do, and I know Richard does, one of the things that everybody stands up and claps for is the moment where there's a veteran, or not a veteran, but a service member who's recognized in the crowd, and everybody sort of does, what good patriots do. They clap and so forth. That would not have happened in the 1st, 2nd, or 3rd century among Christians. To the extent that there were Christians present, they would say, that's odd. Why would people do that? Why would people honor someone who's taking up the sword, who's endorsing violence? Clearly, that's not a Christian thing. We live and have lived for the last 1,500 years, 1,600 years, in a post-Constantinian world. In a world where it's possible to assume that there is no contradiction between Christianity and political empowerment. That's a world that did not come into being until the 4th century and would have been very strange to the people that we're about to read. The Apology of Aristides is not a document I'm familiar with, but apparently from the first couple of centuries, whatever Christians would not wish others to do to them, they do not do to others. And they comfort their oppressors and make them their friends. They do good to their enemies. Through love towards their oppressors, they persuade them to become Christians. Where do you think somebody would get that idea of what Christianity was about? Jesus, Sermon on the Mount? Yeah, it's a pretty direct line. A soldier, this is Hippolytus, the church father, a soldier of the civil authority must be taught not to kill men and to refuse to do so if he is commanded, and to refuse to take an oath. If he is unwilling to comply, he must be rejected for baptism. A military commander or civic magistrate must resign or be rejected. If a believer seeks to become a soldier, he must be rejected, for he has despised God. Any ambiguity there? Pretty clear. The only sort of caveat is if somebody is already in the military service, then there may be a way for them to remain as long as they forswear killing. It's hard to do if you're in the military, but clearly, if you refuse to do these things, then you can't be baptized. So imagine a world in which the church had as one of its rules about baptism, this is adult baptism presumably, you can't be associated with violence in any way, whether it's the police force, military, and so forth. This is a different world. My point is that it's a world that seemed perfectly self-evident to them because of what Jesus had said and because of the fact that they were victims of imperial authority in most cases. They certainly did not enjoy imperial power, and so it made perfect sense that Christians would not support imperial power, which was, in their view, abusive. Okay, so let's jump forward 1,000 years to the Reformation. I love doing this historical sort of pond jumping, but another way of thinking about pacifism is in the Reformation, not so much in the Reformation figures we're familiar with, Luther and Calvin, who tended to be realists, but people like Menno Simons, the founder, the sort of eponymous founder of Mennonites, who believed that if Christians were going to get back to what it meant to be Christian, they needed to forswear violence. Somebody read Menno Simons' description here of what the scriptures teach about violence.
The scriptures teach that there are two opposing princes and two opposing kingdoms. The one is the Prince of Peace, the other is the Prince of Strife. Each of these princes has his particular kingdom, and as the prince is, so is also the kingdom. The Prince of Peace is Christ Jesus. His kingdom is the kingdom of peace, which is his church. His messengers are the messengers of peace. His word is the word of peace. His body is the body of peace. His children are the seed of peace.
Thank you. So, ambiguity here? Not really. Not a lot to interpret. There are two kingdoms. There's a kingdom of peace and the kingdom of, kingdom of strife. There's Christ, there's the devil, there's violence, there's nonviolence. This is a typical Anabaptist sort of understanding of Christians' relationship to the world, that the idea was that the sword, and by that word they indicated everything associated with force or coercion, the sword was unholy, and Christians ought to remove themselves from any connection with it. They shouldn't count on support or defense from the government. They shouldn't be involved in military service and so forth. And so you have people like Mennonites today who are part of this tradition, who, to the extent they can, stand by this approach. And so you have the development of peace churches, which are in America primarily the Church of the Brethren. Mennonites and the Quakers, and they're called that for obvious reasons because they tend to be pacifists, but they took part in the first Peace Church Conference in the States in 1935, and who worked together to make pacifism seem like a viable and really a necessary Christian understanding of violence. And they also include groups like Seventh-day Adventists and Christadelphians, who are less well-known, less mainstream, but nevertheless committed to pacifism. And there are also organizations today that continue this tradition of endorsing pacifism on religious grounds, most important of which is the Fellowship of Reconciliation, which has been around since the 1940s, and groups like Pax Christi, the Anglican Pacifist Fellowship, and the Methodist Peace Fellowship. Did you know that there was an Anglican Pacifist Fellowship? I'm not surprised by that, because I would say it this way: pacifism is, how's this? It's certainly not the default position of most Christians, and it's not something Christians would necessarily be aware of unless it was really part of their tradition, unless they were a Mennonite or a Quaker, someone whose group was defined in terms of that orientation. Okay, so what are the first two? Realism. So you're going to be able to pass the test at the end? You're going to be able to get pacifism and realism, distinguish those two, realism and pacifism? So one more I want to present, which is nonviolent resistance. And I'll start with Gandhi, not because there are no Christian precedents, but I think most Christians in the 20th century who espouse nonviolence have been influenced by Gandhi. People like King and James Lawson, they either traveled to India or they studied Gandhi. Bonhoeffer, as you remember from last time, wanted to go to India to study with Gandhi. The idea was that there was something in Gandhi's understanding of nonviolent resistance that the West really needed and could benefit from. So I found this quote from a speech that Gandhi gave that I think gives a pretty good idea of what the theory behind nonviolence is. Will someone read this?
There are two ways of countering injustice. One way is to smash the head of the man who perpetrates injustice and to get your own head smashed in the process. All strong people in the world adopt this course. Everywhere wars are fought and millions of people are killed. The consequence is not the progress of a nation, but its decline. Pride makes a victorious nation bad-tempered. It falls into luxurious ways of living. Then, for a time, it may be conceded, peace prevails. But after a short while, it comes more and more to be realized that the seeds of war have not been destroyed, but have become 1,000 times more nourished and mighty. No country has ever become, or will ever become, happy through victory in war. A nation does not rise in that way. It only falls further. In fact, what comes to it is defeat, not victory. And if, perchance, either our act or our purpose was ill-conceived, it brings disaster to both belligerents.
It's a very interesting understanding of matters, right? And whether or not we agree with them, I think it's clear what he's describing is realism, right? The approach to violence that says violence may be necessary and we shouldn't hesitate to engage in violence because we'll get victory, we'll get peace, all these things, it's an illusion because that's not really what we get. Okay, so there's a second part of this, which I'll ask somebody else to read. Very good job, by the way.
But through the other method of combating injustice, we alone suffer the consequences of our mistakes. The other side is wholly spared. This other method is satyagraha.
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 Yeah.
One who resorts to it does not have to break another's head. He may merely have his own head broken. He has to be prepared to die himself, suffering all the pain. In opposing the atrocious laws of the government of South Africa, it was this method that we adopted. We made it clear to the said government that we would never bow to its outrageous laws. No clapping is possible without two hands to do it, and no quarrel without two persons to make it. Similarly, no state is possible without two entities.
the rulers and the ruled. You are our sovereign, our government, only so long as we consider ourselves your slaves.
Thanks. Very interesting image here. Satyagraha is usually translated as love force or soul force, right? So the force in nonviolent resistance is not the force that we usually associate with that word. It's a soul force. It's a force that conquers through love. One who resorts to it does not have to break another's head. He may merely have his own head broken. I don't know about you. It does not sound all that attractive as an alternative to breaking someone else's head. Honestly, and I think Augustine would certainly bear this out, being the human beings that we are, we must much rather break someone else's head or see someone else's head broken than having our own broken, or maybe even more importantly, than watching someone that we love having their head broken. So this is a very counterintuitive understanding of things. And this is another misnomer that nonviolence is not nonviolent. What nonviolence is it rejects engaging in violence as a perpetrator. And it almost always invites receiving violence as a victim. And this is what you see in the civil rights movement. If you were part of a nonviolent movement, the one thing you had to be prepared for more than anything else was violence. But not violence that you were going to engage in or respond to, but violence that you were going to suffer in your body as an act of love to reveal the inherent violence on the other side. So it's perhaps unfortunate that it's called nonviolence. The idea is to keep from engaging in violence, but also to provoke violence. And it's very clear from Gandhi that one should expect to have your head broken. That it's going into a nonviolent march is no promise that things are going to remain nonviolent, quite the opposite. So we get to the civil rights era, and I've already mentioned that most of the Americans who are advocates of nonviolence have studied with Gandhi or have, I'm making it difficult for you, sorry, or have studied with Gandhi or certainly are familiar with his work. And there are two kinds of nonviolence that become operative in the civil rights movement. One is philosophical nonviolence, which means a commitment to nonviolence no matter what. It is something that one believes is the correct way to approach violence, to seek for social change, and it doesn't matter what happens to you or whether it's effective or not or judged effective by other people, you're sticking with it. And then there's tactical nonviolence, which means nonviolence as a tactic, which might work in a situation where the person that you're trying to change has a conscience that's easily, that you can penetrate to that conscience, you can prick it, and you can get change to happen. But if that doesn't work, you're not opposed to taking up arms or defending yourself or whatever it means. I don't know how to describe this mathematically, what percentage of people in the civil rights movement were philosophical nonviolence, were philosophically nonviolent, many were tactical. I think probably the leaders tended to be philosophically nonviolent. The soldiers tended to be more tactically nonviolent. It was difficult to keep them committed to nonviolence when their heads were smashed in. Organizations in this country that were committed philosophically to nonviolence include CORE, SCLC, and SNCC, all of which you've heard of because they are the sort of leading organizations in the American civil rights movement. I want to talk about one guy who not only is the most important theorist of nonviolence in this country's history, he's also a Memphian, lived here from 1962 to 1975, James M. Lawson. Here's a picture of him walking down the street. I don't know what street this is, but it's definitely Memphis. I think in about 1968, this is Maxine Smith, this is James Lawson down here. James Lawson was a Methodist minister, and he was one of those people who constantly wore a clerical collar. He was very identifiable as a minister, but he wasn't your typical minister because he was a firebrand, and he was somebody who said exactly what he thought and was willing to go to prison for his views, which he had done after the Korean War. He refused to call up to military service for Korea, went to jail as a result. So his pacifist views, his views on nonviolence were clearly formed early in his life. Went to India shortly after that in the 50s, spent 2 years in India studying with Gandhi and other people. Becomes involved in the civil rights movement, gets arrested several times. This is one particular time in Mississippi. This is when he was in Nashville going to Vanderbilt Divinity School, 1959, 60, and he was arrested and because he was involved in the Nashville sit-in movement. He was expelled from Vanderbilt Divinity School because of his involvement. This is a proud moment for my alma mater, so I'm going to give it a little credit. The entire Divinity School faculty resigned in protest, and Lawson had to be reinstated. So the bishop, when he graduated in 1962, decided, I'll send him far away from trouble, I'll send him to Memphis. So he gets here, and of course he starts doing what he had been doing there. And the thing that Lawson is probably most, to be credited for the most in the civil rights movement, is that he led these workshops on nonviolence all over the place through the 50s and 60s. He did them for the SELC, he did them for CORE, he did them later for SNCC, and he traveled all around the country doing them, and he did them in this case in Ohio in June of 1964 in preparation for Freedom Summer. He was at Centenary United Methodist Church here, and he led these workshops here in Memphis, and here's advertisement, a little blurb from the Commercial Appeal in March 1964 talking about these workshops in Christian nonviolence. So when I interviewed Lawson for my book on the kneel-ins in Memphis, I asked him, what happened at these workshops? He said basically they read the Bible, they read the Sermon on the Mount, talked about Jesus, they talked about other nonviolent resistance campaigns in history, in American history, and also going back as far as he could go. And the other thing they did is they simulated nonviolent protest and what was likely to happen if you were engaged. And these simulations could get pretty rough. You had people, standing or say sitting, simulating sitting at a segregated lunch counter, and you had people around them yelling at them, calling them names, hitting them, doing all these things, and the goal was to retain your cool. And it was somebody's job to take the people who couldn't retain their cool and remove them. So this is what, if you went to one of these workshops in the spring of 1964, this is the flyer that you got that you were supposed to sign. This was your pledge to be involved in the nonviolent movement in Memphis. And I got this from a guy who was actually a participant. This is what's important, I think. I pledge myself, my person and my body, to the nonviolent effort in Memphis. And if you had any illusions that this was going to be something that was kind of fun and spiritually ennobling, as soon as you read this first line, you might start to get a little reluctant, right? I'm pledging my body somehow to the movement of Memphis for racists and angry people to do what they want with it. So I'm supposed to meditate daily on the life and teachings of Jesus, remember that the nonviolent movement seeks justice, not victory, walk and talk in the manner of love, pray daily, sacrifice personal wishes for the struggle, observe with both friend and foe the ordinary rules of courtesy. This is very important. Seek to perform regular service, refrain from violence of fist, tongue, and heart, strive to be in good spiritual and body health, follow the directions of the group leader, and that was very important. So this is what you were signing up for if you were a kid at Rhodes or Des Moines or U of M in 1964 who thought you might want to be involved in nonviolent resistance. A lot of kids, when they saw this, decided maybe, I've got too much to do this semester. Maybe I need to be focusing on the books. But those who did get involved, it was a life-changing experience for them. And by the way, I won't belabor this, but there is a website that's very interesting that has a sort of interactive map of nonviolent campaigns that are going on currently across the world. It's not something that is just relegated to the past. So that leaves us with a few minutes to talk about application of these various orientations to violence to the problems that Richard so helpfully identified for us, right? ISIS and Ferguson. So let's start with ISIS, which I'm assuming I don't need to describe the problem of a group of people in the Middle East who are, well, you describe them. What's the problem that we face?
Okay, I'll do it. Okay, I can do it on behalf of all of us. So Andrew Mikta, your colleague, person of ours, says,
you've got, when you're looking at ISIS, you've got worldwide 50,000 people, and there's only one way to deal with them, and it's not negotiation.
Right.
So I think that is the crux of the problem with ISIS.
Okay. So cut to the chase. 50,000 people, one way to deal with them. So realism, does it provide any sort of helpful guidance in this case?
I'd like to make a point. I think one of the important things about looking at ISIS or like-minded challenges is the relationship of the individual within a collective society, which is specifically Sunni Islam, relationship to Allah, as opposed to our relationship with God as an individual. And so our relationship as an individual as opposed to a collective society, and I think that is part of the challenge, but I think the number 50,000 is quite low. And so there are those who are actively engaged, in these actions, but then there are those who are either tacitly approving of or philosophically approving of these actions. So it's, right. I think the number is far greater than that, actually.
Okay. So do any of these approaches that we've just described give us any guidance for how to deal with this problem, however big it might be?
Realism, just war.
Realism, just war. Say more about that.
Well, I mean, that's the problem with using that seems to be that they are not another system. From what I understand, the problem is the use of just war, which is about the only thing that Rebecca stands on there to fight back with, is that they are not a single state, a state-owned, state-fighting state, using the just war theory.
Traditionally, just war theory applies to states, right? So it would have to be an adaptation of just war theory, which I think is possible. But in general, realism seems to apply better than any of the others, right?
I am most comfortable with it.
Yeah. So here's the way I would apply realism to this. Let's get real, right? These people are, they are bent on the destruction, if not of us, of people that we are obligated to defend or our interests or something like that. They only understand one language. It's not the language of negotiation. The question is, what sorts of force can we afford, sort of domestically to commit, not whether force is appropriate in this case. This is the way the realist, and I think Andrew Meek is a realist, I think it's fair to say, this is the way the realist would approach this problem, right? How much firepower, when, where, how long? Okay, what about pacifism?
Well, presumably you came from those decisions, pacifism or not about existence to accomplish and
Not so much. This is the thing, and I think nonviolent resistance, it's definitely the case that in the civil rights movement there were those who saw it as a tactic. Most people who are pacifists, who use the term pacifism, it's not a tactic. It is a way of life that they're committed to. Because if it were a tactic, it would never be relevant, it would never apply. That's the problem with pacifism. There's very few situations where you say, it makes sense to be a pacifist in this case, right? It's a commitment. The best example I can give you is a book I'm currently reading called The Politics of Jesus by John Howard Yoder. It was written in 1972, republished in the 90s, and it is a thoroughgoing defense of pacifism based on the New Testament. And he is one who sees it as the only viable Christian approach to things. So I say that just because I think it's tempting to say, well, pacifism as a strategy doesn't work here. What does the pacifist do? What does somebody who's already committed to pacifism do in the face of ISIS? Dies. Nothing. Trust God. Right?
Do they do nothing, or do they do things like, there's no way to talk about this without saying incredibly naive, but to build schools and to send aid and to help people get jobs, because it's a warped philosophy that's taking advantage of poverty and the youth explosion and the lack of opportunity.
Yeah.
So could a pacifist response not just be do nothing, but say, I don't know, let's go build things, or or educate people, or
yeah, so the pacifist thinks not, let's think about the violence. Let's think about the reasons behind the violence. Why does this movement exist? Why does it appeal to people? how do we address problems of poverty and alienation and lack of opportunity in these places? And maybe by looking at the roots of those things, we can work, actively, but in a pacifist way that will address the problem. I think that's exactly right. I think people who are pacifists tend to be very actively minded. They don't sit around and wait, as I said, kind of naively for God to do something. So what about nonviolent resistance? Active resistance of ISIS that is not dependent on violence, but to the contrary, expects to have one's head smashed rather than smashing heads, the way Gandhi would put it. Anybody signing up for that?
Sounds like an evolutionary dead end.
Sounds like an evolutionary dead end.
Trying to
Say
figure
more
out the
about that.
difference between it and the active pacifism.
Actually, the latest thing in the pilot in Jordan, I'm not sure you can say he was trying to be nonviolent resistance, but the sort of things that nonviolent resistance do is to call attention to the inherent injustice
Right.
of the tactics of your opponent.
Yeah.
And by immolating this pilot, there has been some recognition that, wait a second, this is not a thing that's acceptable.
Yeah.
But on a day-to-day level, justice is culturally relative. I mean, I don't think ISIS would see that as a justice issue necessarily.
Repeat the question.
And the answer.
The question. Oh, so is nonviolent resistance relevant in this situation? And I'll just answer my own question real quickly by saying that the reason nonviolent resistance worked in the United States to the extent that it worked is that the people that it was working on believed the Bible, believed the Constitution, had a sense of justice, even if it was buried deep inside. King and Lawson and others believed that it was possible to find it, to prick it, and to make people realize that the situation they were defending was not just. So the question would be, is that possible for ISIS? Could you convince them that they're being unjust? Would having them break a few heads cause a sort of crisis of conscience for them where they realize, wow, we're not doing the right thing? Probably not. Bonhoeffer was faced with this problem in Germany. Someone had suggested, if we could just have a massive nonviolent movement in Germany, we could point out to Germans that Hitler's the devil and so forth, and Bonhoeffer thought it was incredibly naive, because Hitler had no conscience, and because he would not hesitate to destroy people without any kind of qualms. Okay, so we've answered that question to everyone's satisfaction, I'm sure. What about Ferguson? So what do we have? Realism. How would it apply to the situation in Ferguson? And Richard, how would you describe the situation in Ferguson as it sort of confronts us?
You've just done to me what I've done to you this entire series. I tend to think about all these questions in relationship to my parish because I'm a pastor. So I have people who here for very good reasons think that and know and can document that a lot of African Americans have just have been targeted by the police. I have 2 police officers in the parish who would not necessarily disagree with that in some cases, but also would tell a different side of the story from that side. So what I see is an incredible amount of pain. And unfortunately, I see and often see this on all of these questions. To be honest, I see 2 people who are right saying very different things. Yeah. And sometimes for me, I have to deal with integrity sometimes that's opposed, but I still, as a pastor, sometimes see integrity.
Right. So your situation is a unique one. And I think every situation is unique. We all see this through different lenses, right? We see that through the lens of someone who has been stopped, without warrant or we see it from the perspective of the policeman who's doing a very difficult job, or we see it from the position of the business owner, whatever it is. Are these categories helpful
Yes,
in this situation? How so?
because we've seen what realism does already, that's played out. Yet if you were looking at it from the active pacifist point of view, that's viable. This isn't a million miles away.
Right.
This actually maybe could even be Memphis, who knows? And that the nonviolent resistance could also have, and in some ways that's already been
Yeah.
played out also.
So the second and third ones seem to you to have some relevance to the situation as we're experiencing it, and it is unfolding, right? We certainly saw nonviolent resistance, but we also saw that sometimes nonviolent resistance, as I was saying with regard to the civil rights movement, it doesn't remain nonviolent, right? There's a price to pay. You're getting close to me suggest that we're out of time, but I just want to say one last thing. I have learned more in preparing for this series than I have in a long time. And I really appreciate knowing that each week I was going to come to a group of people who were eager and engaged, and I really appreciate all that you put into it.
You know, I'll say on behalf of all of us, I know that I can speak for all of you in this case. We're profoundly grateful for what Stephen has done. I don't know that I've ever been in a situation where I've seen somebody with real integrity present a variety of viewpoints. My professor of systematics in seminary used to say, and ingrain this in us, that when you're in a debate or an argument, or you're trying to critique something, you need to learn to describe the opposing viewpoint to your own, or the opposing case in a book that you're reading, in a way that the author or the person with whom you disagree would say, you got it right, you understand where I'm coming from. And you have done that brilliantly, and I know your students, as well as all of us, benefit on a daily basis. We're grateful, and last but not least, I promise we'll have you back.